Bonjour à tous, merci de nous rejoindre pour cette conversation entre la commissaire Franchesca Hebert-Spence et l'artiste Katherine Boyer dans le cadre du parcours public Tout-Terrain, Régale, Regal, organisé par le centre d'exposition L'Imagier sur la rue principale d'Elmer du 13 août au 24 octobre 2021. C'est avec grand plaisir que j'accueille nos deux invités à discuter ici des nuances et des complications liées aux expositions numériques, à la fois du point de vue des créateurs et des commissaires. Cette conversation porte sur l'éthique de la traduction des œuvres dans l'environnement numérique, l'envie de se connecter à un réseau mondial, ainsi qu'une réflexion sur leur approche du numérique en tant que matériau en soi. Je vous invite à visiter le site internet de l'Imagier pour en savoir plus sur les intervenants d'aujourd'hui et l'exposition. Cette discussion vous est offerte en anglais, la langue courante de nos deux intervenantes. Une rediffusion incluant les sous-titres en français sera disponible très bientôt sur nos plateformes de réseaux sociaux. C'est donc sans plus tarder que je laisse la place à Franchesca et Katherine pour commencer cette belle rencontre. Merci.
Thank you very much for that excellent introduction. And first, I'd like to thank Kath for being here, and for l'Imagier for inviting us to speak, and Emily for facilitating our talk today. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the fact that I am on unceded Algonquin territory, currently residing here in Ottawa, but I'm originally from Treaty 1 territory and have a lot of family and connections to the Brandon arts community and the Winnipeg arts community. So that's how I built my relationship and longtime friendship with Katherine Boyer here. I should also maybe mention my name. My name is Franchesca Hebert-Spence, and I am a curator. I prefer to be called a cultural producer, just because there's a lot of different aspects that go into the work that we do, and multidisciplinary and not necessarily limited just to putting on exhibitions and like what those responsibilities are. I am Anishinaabe. My grandmother, Marian Ida Spence, was from Seguin, and I was raised in southern Manitoba. So I've currently doing my PhD here at Carleton University. I am a fellow on the More So project with Dr. Carmen Robertson. I'm an RA for Suzanne Morissette at OCAD University, and I'm an RA for Julie Nagum in the Space Between Us project. So super busy, a lot of responsibilities, and just really, 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 really privileged and grateful for the individuals that spend time and have taken the time to mentor me. So yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Kath to introduce herself and her community affiliations.
Hi, my name's Katherine Boyer. I am Métis on my dad's side and European, English, and Scottish on my mom's. And I happened to be coming to you from Treaty 4 in Regina, Saskatchewan, where I was born and raised. And I happen to be visiting my father at the moment. And I live in Treaty 1 in Winnipeg. I very much consider both places to be my home and very, very integral to who I am as an artist and person. I do a lot of, a huge range of work materially, a lot of beadwork and a lot of woodworking, but then almost anything in between I'll take a shot at. So I think that's one of the reasons why I find myself in a talk that explores things that are digital, when I've never truly felt kind of invested or very integrated into the digital experiences. So the other way I want to sort of introduce myself that's related to the work that's part of the show is through my experiences with parks, because I was raised in an urban space, and our way to reconnect with nature was driving out in the summer for a camping trip to parks, national and provincial. One of the parks we very often drove to was Cypress Hills. We made that trip very, very regularly. But then plenty of Saskatchewan parks, and I remember even once a park in Manitoba. Though I cannot recall which one it was. My dad would probably know. And, while I was a kid at the time, I was reflecting on what my experiences with nature are today and what has kind of, what has formed how I look at the world now. And that's a big one because it was the place where I was introduced to nature and land. And then as I started to process that, I realized I actually didn't know a lot about whose land, what land, the history of that land. And that is the sort of preamble to the work itself. Should I share my screen now?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
This is an artwork. This is the artwork that Kath submitted for the work Tout-Terrain, Régale. That is currently in Ulmer. I will let you talk about it.
I was, very eager to explore some of the iconic symbols that are used to identify spaces for specific types of use in a similar way that parks have been designated for certain types of use. I don't want to, trail too far into a great deal of the history, but I do hope that I can provide some resources at the end. The words that are carved into the surface is the words designated use, kind of on repeat, blending sort of into each line, and it goes on and on and on, kind of forever on every surface of the work. So a viewer to the digital experience would have this picnic table floating in the space. The digital element ended up being quite integral to the content as well, almost inadvertently. I do consider myself a very sort of hands-on, physical material worker, and so it seemed like an obvious thing to make this in a physical way, in a very physical, time-consuming way. These words are etched, by hand into every surface. The sudden inaccessibility of the object itself in a digital way, aside from viewing, was really the kind of core of the message. Parks are typically available to select few people who have money, who have cars, who have free time to take vacation. There's a number of layers of privilege that comes with being able to access parks in a leisurely way, and that tourism industry is a big kind of cornerstone of the issue, right? The digitization of the work and the translation into a intangible thing was a very appropriate. That's a good kind of maybe beginning introduction.
I have a question about the digital art you're doing. Is it since COVID you developed this new techniques of doing art digitally, or you were doing this before?
I've never done anything really digitally. I've done one project that was exclusively digital. This to me was more of a translation and more of an adaptation. I consider the work to be a sculpture still, even though it's kind of you can't totally grab it as a sculpture would normally be grabbed. Good question.
I think the move that's happening right now, where exhibitions are being shifted into digital realms, is a clear response to COVID-19 and the pandemic, the lockdowns and the limitations of spaces for people. That really actually was the reason why the exhibition is augmented reality, because we couldn't anticipate what was going to be permissible in the 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. I forget when I was first approached to curate this, like to not be aware of what was going to be allowed. And that became like a really big process of the curating, was one, figuring out like what platform were we going to use? Like if we were going to do installations, like physical installations, like we would have to work with really immediate, really local artists to make sure that if travel isn't allowed, or it became really interesting and a little bit complicated to plan ahead of time. And obviously like an augmented reality exhibition is not any simpler than any of those Kat starts laughing. It's not like this idea and like the conversation that Kath and I want to have today and to have like recorded is the process of turning what are usually physical exhibitions and physical art pieces into digital experiences, and what that means in terms of like conversations between artists and curators. I initially approached Kath and asked if Kath would submit like an unfinished work that is a beaded vest. And like the conversations that we went through on like, is submitting like, first of all, an unfinished work, what does the vest mean? And could you like really experience it as a three-dimensional object in digital space? Like it really did steamroll into a lot of other questions and conversations. And the picnic bench became like this really interesting conversation because it was really located specifically in Almer, and specifically in it as like a tourist area and an area that like was really, really impacted in the pandemic. When I did my first site visit, there was nobody on the street and it was rainy. It was also spring, so there's still snow and puddles everywhere. But just to see the ways that like bustling community spaces became like completely empty, and not like completely empty. Like we talk about like the market and talk about like the economic impacts on individuals accessing like social supports in the pandemic. They're not empty, it's just people aren't visible. But to like back up a little bit, to see people not participating in like capitalist activities within these spaces seemed a little bit jarring. To see the promenade as like such an important part of that community, and to see it in the summer when the restrictions were lifted, and to see how lively it was. I'm pretty sure the last time I was there, I saw someone walking a little like micro pet pig. It's a completely different experience. And so to think about access and for Kath to engage with that community and that culture specifically.
Yeah, and to sort of jump in at the point of like economy and capitalism, the sort of run-on word of designated use, designated use, designated use, designated use. The quality of repetition is one of the ways that we have, you know, gotten here, right? Where economy kind of rules all, but there's these motions that we've in society have been going through that makes it hard to recognize the things that are wrong and the things that could be better, because it's been this kind of continuous motion. We kind of lose the corners, right? It's just it's not as sharp. We're not as aware because it's a system that's been in regular mode for a long time. You know, that's one way that the work does help to name that. Yeah, and in this moment where economy was looked different. It looked very different for a while, still does, but yeah, we're suddenly aware of the ways that it could be way better. We've been quite aware. I shouldn't say that this was one moment, but it is a moment.
Part of the conversation, and especially like Régale, is this idea of like culturally shifting concepts around like what is precious, right? To like celebrate and to like value and to grasp, and all of these other like verbs of like cherishing things has changed. And so to go to this space and to see it empty and recognize that like being together to like visit your dad and to do site visits, all of these are things that like taken for granted, but specifically like Indigenous artists have been making work about valuing like family and gathering and the land and our relationships to the land, and also questioning like these powers that designate certain spaces for whatever. Like these are things that Indigenous artists have been doing for like decades. And to see that shift happening on a larger Canadian cultural sphere and like consciousness, bringing together the artists that were brought for the show, yourself, Caroline Monet, Carrie Allison, Natalie King, and Heather Campbell. All of the works were really about what was precious and what was significant and what was valuable, not necessarily from like an economic perspective, but from something that's a lot less tangible. Again, like this idea of like tangibility, like measurements, units, Gestalt. Sorry, Gestalt is a word for like knowing something, like physically knowing an object. And like you can draw a chair, but like, can you draw the weight of the chair? Can you draw the noise while you're dragging it along on the floor? Like, do you know that chair? It's like this really interesting concept that I was taught in my early like undergrad drawing classes, and I've always really really been really into it. But yeah, so this I think specifically, how are those intangible things like just as weighty as potentially like the economic impact that like the pandemic has had, right? Like we can feel the economic impact, we see the economic impact every day. How do we measure, how do we see the like emotional impact and the intangible aspects? And I think that's really highlighted in the works that everybody has made, but like also in particular, like to have like a picnic bench in front of a business that Saint-Camberon, which is a bar, and they make their own, like, I forget what the word is for beers that are like made locally.
Like craft beer?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can't eat gluten. I can't drink beer. Yeah, to make craft beers and just be like a gathering place and community, and to have like these picnic benches out front, and then to have this like imaginary bench that exists in another place that's also talking about like the construction and history of these green spaces. Is just an interesting juxtaposition, and also just a really gentle reminder that the things that like we find solace in, and the spaces that we like escape to nature, which like in of itself is like a really interesting statement, because nature is a construct. How are we aware of the ways in which the places where we find like relaxation are also at like a cost to other folks? To announce that I'm on unceded Algonquin territory, right? My existence here in Ottawa is at the expense of the communities around me. It's at the expense of like the Zibi and the Algonquin community members who live here in Ottawa. Like, how do we contend with that? This talk has taken a very sideways turn.
I don't think it has. I mean, the work I think is about just knowing where you are and knowing the history of where you are. And, you know, a really important piece of why we do land acknowledgements. I mean, we're not in the same place. We're in between kind of 3 or 4 different places, right? Between where we live and where we've grown up and where we currently reside and where we feel connected to. So there's a huge range of places that we're accountable to. The tricky thing is that where is the resolution, and that's what we can't exactly answer. But I really like that. I mean, it's really easy to bring up that nature is a construct, especially within a park atmosphere, and that's maybe where we see it. But we've kind of tricked ourselves into also thinking that that's the version of of nature that's natural.
Yeah.
So typically a picnic table waiting for you when you arrive into this cleared clearing. There's like one spot ideally for your tent or, you know, what have you. Everything's just ready for the consumer. Yeah, and that picnic bench is such a signal to what type of activity is supposed to happen here and there, right? You might be, meeting up to have some craft beer and catch up with friends or try this new thing out, and a campsite, right? You know exactly where you're supposed to eat, how you're supposed to cook it typically.
I think it's an interesting like parallel though, like in order to access these spaces and to be able to engage with them, you need to like perform in them properly.
Right.
And like we think about that with like digital spaces, right? Like we think about how, well, not necessarily like it's actually like the reverse within digital spaces, also the reverse in acknowledging where you are through a digital space.
Yeah.
I don't know at the beginning of the pandemic how many times I attended things and people didn't do land acknowledgements. They weren't on land, they were on Zoom, right? So like how do we date and how do we like locate ourselves within a specific scope or a specific place or a specific time? Like are all these Zoom talks going to be like specifically located or identified as like pandemic talks? Are we going to locate like what date and time this happens and like what are the conditions right now? Like there's fortunately like a little bit of sunlight coming in. Like there's this idea that within digital spaces there's like this like floating nebulousness of it, and that also involves like conduct and discussions and speech, and I won't go too far down that rabbit hole, but I think like there's still a certain set of responsibilities and obligations that you have to create work that's located in a space or located in an idea. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean that it needs to be consumed everywhere. And just because like a talk is on the internet means that it's for all audiences, right? This is also a conversation that like Indigenous cultural producers run into all the time. Like, how are you making what you're talking about accessible to everybody? It needs to be consumable. And so like there's this really wonderful book called Hungry Listening that's about like the consumption of like specifically music, but this can be adapted to any kind of cultural production. Well, my priorities, my writing should be accessible to community members. And so creating like really dense academic writing is not something that I've been in university for a long time. So I do sometimes see that my like lexicon or like the words that I use are slipping into that space, but that's not like my intention. There's always like a little bit of a self-scold that happens. The intention within other spaces sometimes is to make sure that like everything that you're talking about can be like universally related to, when in reality, Indigenous experiences can be shared across different communities and across different demographics who also experience colonial powers or patriarchal powers or the impact of like capitalism, but they are still Indigenous experiences. It's really interesting to see like this shift to globalism also mirrored in like this global public within online exhibitions. And it might be like good to note here in the talk that like these are site specific works that are geotagged to a specific business, to a specific place on the promenade. And you have to be there in person to see them. Like that is what's necessary to engage with this exhibition, and shifts a little bit from the idea of like the online exhibition of being like two-dimensional artworks that you see on a website or within a virtual space. It really is about like a local community and a local experience, and relates again to like what Kath was thinking through and how Kath responded to like, maybe you can submit an image of a sky vest which is very beautiful, by the way. And when Kath actually, when you exhibit it or wear it to a thing, I will definitely post it.
It's literally coming in like 2022, not this year. Yeah, that makes me think, it makes me think to ask the question, are digital spaces more equitable and fair than physical spaces? You're a hard no on that.
Oh, well, you think about like privilege and you think about like access. In order to access a digital space, you need high-speed internet. You need a device that's up to date. Even within the exhibition, we can only cater to like iPhone users, which is fine because that is the app that we have and we had access to, and we're able to collaborate with a local artist. But there's a lot of like weighing of like, okay, like we don't have the budget to work with like a high-end AR app developer. We want it to work well. Like what's like an AR app that doesn't like actually work well? Is that like better than having something that for sure works that's only usable for iPhones? Nothing really equitable about having to like juggle all of those. And even just again, like basics. I didn't have like a smartphone until I was in my mid-20s because I couldn't afford one. I went to China and back and didn't have a smartphone, and someone gave me their old iPod. But it is privilege. It is privilege to be able to get into the spaces, and like this myth about like equity and even just like foot traffic, like who gets to see, like if your site, if your algorithm isn't like on the right page of like the search engine, like what audience is accessing your materials of whatever you're producing. So this idea of like a digital space being a demographic space and like one that's anti-capitalist, like that ship has sailed. Yeah, like what do you think about that in terms of like having your work within a digital space and versus like having your physical picnic table, your sculpture, like would people be able to sit on it?
Yes, it works. Yeah, I know, like if I take that same question and apply it to the piece, the physical version of it is way more accessible than the digital version. But yeah, I mean, in terms of a kind of wider question, I actually do side with you.
Yeah.
Similar opinion, but also with a kind of caveat of knowing how inaccessible physical spaces are for a lot of people, given what they look like and what they want to do in them, how they want to live in them. Interesting part, you're right, is that the show and work is actually site specific. So it's kind of got this pull from the vocabulary of art jargon anyways, right? It's site specific rather than a digital work.
Locative media.
Locative media. I'm writing down all the words that I don't understand. We'll Google later.
There was, I was really lucky. My friend like Nicole, who's now like the curator at the director at the Concordia like art gallery. She was telling, when I was first talking about the project to her, she was like, oh, there was like this really cool residency in Banff, and led me to like the artwork and this engagement with like digital media that's specific to place. There have been exhibitions of people doing AR and it's been non-site specific, and I've like written about Julie Nagam's coordination of like Toronto Nuit Blanche in, I think it was like 2020 now, how like interesting that was. And then also what like Imaginative did by creating like a streaming service, and they're doing it again this year while also blending in-person films at TIFF. It's really important to get Indigenous art out there. It's really important to also feel like you own and like have like this belonging or intimate relationship. But there's this like adapting of like material that can happen within digital spaces. It's really interesting. Earlier we were talking about Redbubble and like beadwork designs being like put onto like tote bags and like jumpers and Like I have a duvet cover with Jean's beadwork on it now. In some ways, like there's like a market. It's one way to like support artists, like especially Indigenous artists. But then there's also this idea of like ownership and claiming. And as like a beader and as somebody who works also, like beads are very small and they're very intimate. The scale of the beadwork and the scale of the patterns changes really drastically. And I would want to hear your thoughts on that.
It's inevitable that we slipped into talking about beadwork. It really
There are no beads.
Yeah, I mean, I love that adaptation. And I love that word because we've been doing that forever. Adapting to incoming mediums, to incoming circumstances, to even tourism. We've been adapting to support for Indigenous artists to support ourselves in so many ways. So that word is a very key one to the conversation. Something that I really like is the specificity of thinking more about that as kind of not like a new medium, in a sense, an expanded beadwork practice. In the same way that like a sculpture in a digital sculpture is an expanded version of a sculpture, right? As we might more like traditionally understand it. And to me, that is where we're going with adaptation, with adapting to need and to supporting makers in a way that's I actually don't know Redbubble. So, but you know, if it's like an ethical platform, yeah, yippee, that's great. I love it. So yeah, I think that word is a key to kind of take forward and just embrace it as what that is, rather than
or like reinstall these hierarchies of like what is real and what's not real. Not all artwork adapts to digital spaces well.
Sure.
The scale is completely different. One of the things that I'm really interested in is actually potentially taking the artwork that's in the exhibition and installing it in like a physical space at some point. I'm thinking about like, how does that change the relationship between the works, right? It wouldn't even be feasible to install some of these artworks outside of these businesses because some of them are works on paper. Like some of them are video, and to like install a video outside of a busy like restaurant and play it for 3 months, that just isn't feasible. To have like shots of Curator data running and to be there scattered around this business is really to have these stills of like these wonderful, powerful like matriarchs in Montreal, like omnipresent in this place where people are also dining and celebrating and enjoying themselves, and celebrating each other is just really beautiful. But that couldn't happen. Like everybody would be watching. They would be watching and they would be doing their thing, and the audio, and then they're talking. Like those things wouldn't be compatible. We couldn't actually do this in person. We could definitely install your picnic table and also see like how people would react to it. See if people would like carve into it or add their own like their works that would be stronger in person, or like not stronger because that again like creates the hierarchy, but would be as effective in person. I think that's a really interesting thing about taking physical objects and putting them in digital spheres, and also thinking about the ethics of whether or not it serves the artwork or if it serves the artist's intent. Just slapping anything into these spaces isn't. There's a certain like ethics that needs to happen.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of two works that could not be viewed simultaneously, I mean, in like from a curatorial perspective, is that where you would have them in like 2 separate rooms, right?
Yeah.
Is that like, I'm just asking actually.
You would have to create like walls and then a sound barrier, and you'd also have to draw curtains. Like if I wanted to install a video beside your bench that needed like spots, it would look very good with like some angled spots. It's called light pollution or like light bleed. And that would affect people's ability to see Carolyn's work. The space that people would need to like navigate your work, if it was in a gallery setting, would need to be greater, because also just like the mass, like how heavy the work is, like that visually pulls people to it. And it's entirely possible that your work would overpower, like, for example, like Natalie King's paintings are quite big. They have big works, but maybe Heather Campbell's, they're ink and water, and they're really, really delicate and flowy. And if they're on the wall and then your picnic bench is like here, Guardians Gatekeepers, that's the title of the work. I should probably not keep calling it the picnic bench. But like Guardian Gatekeepers, those are the considerations of space. Whereas like within this work, everything is to the same size. Like you have them on the phone and you can click them and then blow it up and move closer and further away.
Wow. So yeah, so in this case, yeah, the digital has certainly allowed for a show that's impossible in person.
I might like, if I was doing it in person and I started with the show in person, I might have asked for like 4 images from Heather. I might have wanted like a series that like all kind of speak to the same thing, and like the considerations of what's on the floor, what's on the walls, and how, versus like, how does this object relate to this business? And how does the order that people might come at it from like the far side of the promenade from the river, or the river to the far side? What are people thinking when they go and get ice cream? How are people eating ice cream going to respond to Natalie King's work about, you know, empowerment and self-love, right? I like to think about self-love when I'm eating ice cream. So these are considerations. These are different considerations. And
I really like how that that fact alone is a really kind of nice lesson in how the to what digital actually brings forward in terms of looking and seeing, and to maybe like bring things back around. That to me is one of the most important things in researching and understanding the history of these places, and actually having to look and find and learn more and go through the effort to do that, you know. So I think that what digital allows us to do is a range of different things that we can't necessarily do the same way in a physical space, right?
Yeah.
Is that a decent metaphor? Maybe that was too.
No, I think that's really good, because like how do we think about what the strengths are and how do we play to them?
Exactly.
If the instant response to having an online exhibition is like, okay, we can do a global audience, how do we question those things, and how do we like keep the sensitivity and gestalt and like this connection to place? How do we ensure that it's a priority while we're planning? It's nice to like be able to have those conversations with artists through the process and be transparent about it, because I don't think I would have come up with half of the solutions for the artworks if it hadn't been like the conversations I had had with everybody. Really helpful. But is there anything else that you'd like to say about your artwork that, you know, we haven't like touched on?
No, actually, I don't think I have anything to add. I'm really excited to kind of share this, like the resources that I've found about the content, because I had to work hard to find them. I even had research help from a research assistant myself. So I'd really like to share them. Yeah, so this is a big, this book, Parks Canada, is very kind of comprehensive. The other one that I was really, that really resonated with me was written by Jessica DeWitt, called called Parks Are Not for Profit, or Park Mythology and White Denial. So those two have been, a big cornerstone to what I've learned, and I'm grateful for their existence.
I think another resource that was really interesting and really helped tap into like what you've been talking about and this idea around access, and which I read the other week actually for Suzanne, was Stolen City, and it's the history of Winnipeg. But this idea of like urban spaces and urban construction, and this idea of globalism and like the impact of globalism. So Stolen City, Racial Capitalism and the Making of Winnipeg, and it's by Owen Taves, but it's spelled toes. So that's also a really, really valuable resource for understanding urban planning.
I also like the idea of including hungry listening in this as a resource, because I think that's because I read as well simultaneously in making the work, and while there wasn't an audio sound experience as part of it, I can't help but feel like it's leaked into your kind of thought process, and is part of mine too, I guess. So
the first time I hear about like digital art, so I'm like, sometimes I don't really understand everything you're saying because it's really new for me, but it seems really interesting. And
AR is augmented reality, and it means that there's like a mediated space between you and the artwork. For example, way back when Google was developing those glasses, and that's like essentially you don't have like a fully constructed virtual space, you just have like a pop-up screen that comes up and you can still see your surroundings. Same thing with your phone and Pokemon Go. If you don't turn the AR off, you can still see like the grass and the trees, and you see like the little Pokemon existing in the space, takes the space that you're already in, and then superimposes either like a filter or a little sprite. And in this case, it was art submitted and developed and made by various artists. Well, on that note, thank you everybody for coming and watching and attending.
yeah, and thank you for joining us.